You're tuned into Masters of the Genre, where I, Cardinal Sin, take you right to the source of the most important genre creators of their generation. Authors, actors, directors, science fiction, fantasy, comics, film, and other creators that shape our genre fiction and entertainment. Get ready to leave the world of the everyday behind and go head-to-head with the masters of the genre. Greetings, followers. It is I, Cardinal Sin, and I would like to welcome you to Masters of the Genre, episode number 10. And I will introduce our guest for this evening, who is Paul Di Filippo. And he sold his first short story at the tender age of 23. Since then, he sold over 200 more, afterwards collected along with many novels into nearly 50 books. Paul is the author of hundreds of short stories, some of which have been collected into these widely praised collections: the Steampunk trilogy, Ribofunk, Fractal Paisleys, Lost Pages, Little Doors, Strange Trades, Babylon Sisters, and his multiple award-nominated novella, A Year in the Linear City. Another earlier collection, Destroy All Brains, was published by Pirate Warnings, but is quite rare because of the extremely short print run. If you see one, buy it. The popularity of Di Filippo's short stories sometimes distracts from the impact of his mind-bending, utterly unclassifiable novels: Ciphers, Joe's Liver, Fuzzy Dice, A Mouthful of Tongues, and Spondylix. Paul's offbeat sensibility, soulful characterizations, exquisite yet compact prose, and laugh-out-loud dialogue give his work a charmingly unique voice that is both compelling and addictive. He has been a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, BSFA, Philip K. Dick, Wired Magazine, and World Fantasy Awards. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island, in the shadow of H.P. Lovecraft, with his partner, Deborah Newton, and a Cocker Spaniel. Welcome back to Masters of the Genre, Paul Di Filippo.
Gil, what a supremely well done and humbling introduction. It's I think we had so much fun the last time we vowed to do it again, and I'm so happy to be back here after. I apologize to all our listeners for the delayed start time. It was totally my fault. Some technical glitches on my end. I don't want you thinking that your fearless leader is less than 100% dedicated and proficient in his chosen field. But in any case, we're here now with a good stretch of time ahead of us, and you're seeing, because I had to jump onto my wife's computer, you're seeing the background of her office instead of that book cave that was visible in the little clip ahead of time. So there's a lot of knitting needles. That's not my proficiency, but I certainly know a little bit about it.
I used to know how to knit.
Having lived with Deborah all these years and watched her master her chosen profession, she's kind of the queen of knitting. If anybody in the audience has an interest in knitting or has friends who knit, they'll likely recognize her name. So we're sharing her office today.
I used to know how to knit, but I've long since forgotten. I do want to recognize some folks in the chat here. Herc130 is here. Hello. Lawrence Martin is here. And Lawrence Martin is looking forward to the stream. Stephen Ernst is here and says, I love his cyberpunk material.
Oh, thank you, Stephen.
Malia Grimm is here and says, hi, everyone. And it's great to have everybody here. And let's just jump right in. Paul, what do you say?
I am game. This, I guess, technically, is this a Ask Me Anything session here?
Well, it's more of a casual conversation than a formal interview.
We always have fun just dishing the dirt and the high-flown intellectual ideation that we are so famous for.
Exactly. Exactly. You fall in with some of my favorite authors: Gardner Dozois, Greg Bear, John Shirley, William Gibson, Louis Shiner, Rudy Rucker, and others that represent what came to be known as the cyberpunk writers. Mm-hmm. I have two questions. Mm-hmm. One, do you feel that consciously or unconsciously there was a movement of these writers? And two, are you friends with many of them?
Well, first of all, it's funny that you bring up cyberpunk at this juncture in time, my personal timeline, because I'm reading the autobiography of Charles Platt. Now, that's a name that folks might recognize. Charles Platt, an English-born in the UK, living in America for many decades, though. Charles Platt was instrumental in the Michael Moorcock New Worlds scene. He helped produce issues of New Worlds. He was part of the new wave of science fiction during the 60s and 70s. And he later, he's been in the field his whole life, and he later became friends with many of the cyberpunks. And in his recent volume of autobiography, this is volume 4, in fact, he talks about hanging out with Bruce Sterling in the early days of cyberpunk. And you asked if it was a definite movement. As Platt reports, the conversations he had with Bruce, and he also reports some early conventions where cyberpunk made its debut. There were some infamous panels where fights broke out and people stormed off the stage. As Platt reports all this, he conveys that it really was a very intentional. There was a little bit of organic spontaneity in the fact that all these people began writing about the same time, myself included. But once especially after Bill Gibson's Neuromancer took off so big, there was a lot of intentionality about it, a lot of determination to kind of push the genre forward in a way that had been done by the New Wave people. And earlier, science fiction has been marked throughout its history. Let's say it's roughly 100 years old now, maybe a bit older if we go back to Wells and Verne, of course. Mm-hmm. But during its 150 years of existence, science fiction has always been marked by these revolutionary phase changes or paradigm shifts or great leap forwards, whatever you'd care to characterize them as. And, just like when Gernsback launched Amazing Stories, that was a huge paradigm shift because it codified, that there was this stuff called science fiction, and there were people practicing it. And then throughout, when John Campbell came into the helm of Astounding, that was another huge paradigm shift. In the 50s, you had the Galaxy magazine and Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, they were complementary paradigm shifts that happened to be occurring simultaneously. And so cyberpunk was another one of these generational phase changes in the field. And once people started to realize that, much of it did become programmatic or intentional. So I think hopefully that answers the first half of your question. The second half, am I still in touch with these people? About 5 years ago, I realized that I, was having conversations like one-on-one with people who had been shared the table of contents of Mirror Shades with me. If we look at that kind of definitive volume as labeling the core cyberpunks, although of course there were other people on the periphery of that doing equally valid work. I had been in touch one-on-one with those people, but not as a group. And so I set up a little mailing list maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's very sporadic. It usually, for instance, John Shirley just sent a post to the mailing list about the great extinction going on now and climate change, issues that interest him. But generally, the list perks up whenever there's some mass media article about cyberpunk, and we look at it and either laugh or approve or chortle at how the movement is still existing, 30 years later, 35 years later. So I am in contact with those folks. And then on Facebook, I don't know if people recognize the name of Bruce Bethke. He runs a little magazine now that Stupefying Stories, kind of ironically or half-jokingly named. But Bruce produces that. But Bruce was the fellow who actually coined the term cyberpunk and used it in a story of his. And he never really got all the recognition that he deserved. He produced, a string of stories and a couple of good novels. But I probably should add him to the mailing list. But I don't know if he maintains enough general interest in cyberpunk, but I talk to him occasionally about it. So yes, it's amazing that 35 or almost 40 years later, we're all still productive, we're all still working. There's been one kind of dropout from that Mirror Shades anthology. That would be the writer Tom Maddox. You'll see his name on the Mirror Shades table of contents, and he pretty much has stopped producing fiction and dropped out of contact with folks. So so he's among the missing. But it's amazing to me when careers are so short in this field. You have so many people who enter the field and they might make a big splash, and they might, or they might just putter along at a modest level of achievement. But in any case, they quite often, after 5, 7, 10 years, they disappear for one reason or another. And it amazes me that all those folks on the cyberpunk table of contents, the Mirror Shades table of contents, is still being productive as we turn into ancient geezers here. So that was a seminal. I was so lucky to be part of that and associated with it, and I maintain a lot of gratitude for those days.
Absolutely. You sold your first short story at age 23. I imagine you got at least some rejection letters before that or after. What's your best advice to writers looking for representation or publication, especially in the age of the Kindle or the ebook?
Well, the scene has changed so much from when I began, but I think I have a little grasp of it still, because I'm still active, I'm still submitting stuff and still getting rejections, which is I think part of a writer's life up until the day he gives up or croaks or is otherwise put out to pasture. But in terms of short stories, it's a pretty simple process, especially nowadays with online submissions. You just need to track down a magazine where you'd like to appear, someplace that you think is congenial for your type of fiction. And that's a huge prerequisite or step that excuse me, that you have to take is you don't want to be sending a story, a ghost story, to Analog Magazine unless maybe it's a ghost story with some kind of technological rationale behind it, because they're hardcore science fiction. And likewise, if you pick a magazine that focuses on pure fantasy, don't be sending them, a space opera tale, because that's not going to appeal to them. So after you do your research into what kind of magazine you're hoping to approach, then the online submission process is so transparent. In most cases, there's a special web page where you upload your story as an appropriate file, and sit back and wait for either acceptance or rejection. So on the short story level, it's really welcoming to newcomers and to beginners of all types. Once you put a little effort into doing your research. Now, book publication is another tale entirely. A lot of, as we all know, the publishing conglomerates number about 5 major firms. They're called the Big Five. There used to be the Big Six until the most recent merger a few years ago between Random House and Penguin, and that consolidated the firms down from 6 to 5. And in fact, everybody hoped beyond hope that the new firm would be called Random Penguin, but that did not work out. The corporate overlords thought that perhaps Random Penguin was too silly a name. But there are 5 major firms that controlled, like 90% of the books that we see in terms of professionally published books. And a lot of now, they have within each of those 5 big firms, there are separate lines and separate imprints that you can deal with that have almost a semi-autonomous way of working within their corporate umbrella. But many of these imprints and editors won't look at any material that doesn't come from an agent. So right away, you've got a catch-22. I can't get a book into print without an agent, but I can't get an agent without a book in print. So that has become kind of a stumbling block. And the only thing is, lots of times, if you can make something of a name or a track record for yourself as a short story writer, then that's how an agent will take an interest in you, especially, if one of your stories ends up on an award ballot. That's obviously a bit of cachet that might convince an agent to take you on as a client. Sometimes one of the big firms announces that they're having like an open reading period where they will accept anything that comes in from an individual rather than an agent. So you have to kind of keep your antennas open for those periods to happen. But nowadays, as we well know, the self-publishing route has become well, at the top level, you have people making huge incomes. Somebody like Hugh Howey, who started out his novel Wool, and then of course you have those crazy success stories like 50 Shades of Grey, how it went from self-publishing to this mega monster series. But below that level, there are many people in all genres, romance, science fiction, crime, who are earning, decent incomes and getting their work out there in front of an audience strictly through the self-publication route. But it involves, I haven't particularly done that because it does involve a ton of extra work on the part of the writer. You have to take off your creative writer's cap, and you have to put on, the accountant's, publicist, typesetter cap, and you have to do a ton of work. You can outsource some of the work. Like there are editors who are freelance editors who will look at your manuscript and give you very professional advice on it, just as you would receive from one of the big five corporations. So, but once again, they expect to be paid for their work, quite rightfully so, and so you've got to come up with some capital. Self-publishing is not necessarily a $0 activity. You have to come up with money to pay editors. Suppose you want to buy some cover art. There's more expenses, and so if you really want to do self-publishing right, you've got to have a little feedstock of cash to kind of propel it and get it off the ground. But having said that, you can just look around and see that that it's a not it's a quite respectable and well utilized route to appearing in print if you don't have any success with the big corporations.
Your first book was the Steampunk trilogy.
Yep.
And your latest is the Summer Thieves, which happens to be our giveaway today. Thank you very much.
I have a copy waiting to go out to some lucky winner. I might tuck a little something extra in there too.
Thank you very much. That's very generous of you. I'm curious, how has your writing process changed in between the two?
Well, that's an excellent question, Gil. All right, here's an example. I used to be kind of anal about plotting everything out to minute details, and the latest book, which you might not know about because I just sold it about a month ago. It's going to appear in 2023. Which seems like forever, but I guess it'll be here before we realize it. The newest book, I kind of just dove into it with a lot of it very nebulous, a lot of the plot and even the characters very nebulous in my conception of the book, and I just had to trust that each day would reveal a sufficient stretch of road ahead that I could do the next day's work. That's a famous metaphor that someone came up with. I wish I remembered who actually said it to give them credit, but they said writing a book is like driving down a dark country road and your headlights show like 100 yards ahead. It's very clear, and beyond that is a wall of blackness. So your car goes ahead, 10 feet over the next 10 seconds or whatever, or 10 minutes, and then you can see a further 100 yards, and so on and so on. And the parts of the road that were black now are revealed, and that's what I had to trust. Is that my 40 years instincts of authorship, of writing, would carry me down these kind of undetermined black stretches of road. So I kind of surprised myself by completing this new novel, which, by the way, is called Vanjie's Ghosts. And it sounds like a pure horror novel. And it actually starts out, you might think you're reading a horror novel, but then it segues into equally hardcore science fiction. So I thought I was kind of pleased that I was able to create this hybrid production and have it work successfully. But it's a little trepidatious, a little scary to dive into a book not knowing. I had the ending somewhat in mind, but the ending that actually appeared, was maybe 90 degrees different from what I had in mind. So to write like that is something I probably wouldn't have attempted way back when I was doing the Steampunk trilogy, where I was more anal about charting things out and outlining and so forth. So that's probably the biggest change. I always think that something that other people have said is that beginning writers are too cautious. You should really, I think. I like that. I like that comment at the bottom there. The ending can often predetermine what comes before. But beginning writers are too cautious. I think you should trust your insanity a little and trust your obsessions and your bliss and everything, and just rather than try to produce something that is conventional or has been done before, why not channel your unique individuality onto the page and really we all start out emulating our heroes. I certainly did too. And in fact, even this newest book, Vanjie's Ghosts, I kept thinking, this is my Theodore Sturgeon novel, a very famous classic SF author, Theodore Sturgeon, one of the best guys the field has ever produced. It was, I thought I should have a bracelet like what would Jesus do, but mine would say what would Sturgeon do, when I was writing this book, because it helps to have kind of like a shining role model or example. And I've always done that, but you don't want to be a total mimic or imitator, obviously, either. So I don't disparage, somebody like loves the work of, I don't know, pick anybody.
Robert Sheckley.
What's that, Gil?
Robert Sheckley.
Yeah, Robert Sheckley, who, by the way, has been kind of out of print these days, but there's a big brand new hardcover collection. It's like 600 pages of prime Robert Sheckley stories that just launched this week from a firm called Centipede Press. So if anybody likes Robert Sheckley, go to the Centipede Press webpage and check out their new offering. But yeah, say you like, I don't know, say you grew up on Harry Potter and you want to produce some fantasy novel that has the impact or the allure of the Potter books, that's okay, but to write a simple Harry Potter ripoff or pastiche, I shouldn't say ripoff because that implies kind of base motives, and we're not talking about someone who has, plagiaristic motives here. We're talking about somebody who has very noble motives, actually, to create a work of beautiful art. But they to create something that's a total pastiche is not going to get you anywhere. You need to inject your own, use it just as a platform and inject your own individuality into it.
I've brought up the centipedepress.com page, and boy, there's lots of interesting stuff there.
Oh yeah, they're an excellent press. They reprint a lot of classics, but they also assemble, like the Sheckley volume is brand new, and they have a series called Masters of Science Fiction, and I think they have Masters of Fantasy too. And so they often rescue great writers who are kind of underrepresented these days.
I see they have Frank Belknap Long.
Yep.
Lots of great stuff. Swords of Lancomar.
Yep.
All stuff that I was really into when I was a kid. And beyond, of course.
And the books themselves are beautiful works of bookmaking ledger domain. They're very, they often have the cloth bookmark and the paper is high quality and the binding is wonderful. What they're doing, one thing that Centipede Press is doing is, I don't know if your audience knows the name R.A. Lafferty. I'm sure you know that author, Gil. R.A. Lafferty, he was big in he was never big, but he was much admired and idolized by a certain cult of aficionados in the 60s and 70s. And when Lafferty died, he kind of went out of print naturally, which happens all too often. But Centipede Press is, I think they're up to like volume 6 in his complete short stories. So they're preserving his work very admirably.
Absolutely. And I wanted to show these books again because I think that there were some glare problems.
That's coming. Yeah, it's a little bit of glare, but it's a beautiful space opera type cover. I had a friend who said the cover only represented a minority of what happens in the book because they're only in space for a limited amount of time, going from one rather exotic world to another. So my role model on the Summer Thieves was Jack Vance. He's someone that I just find phenomenal. I can read him. He's someone who has not deteriorated over the years. I think his work has held up remarkably well. He has a great following. He was one of the few writers that the New York Times Sunday magazine chose to profile from our genre. They've never focused very much, obviously, on genre writers. But one Sunday, I opened up the New York Times magazine, and there was a profile of Jack Vance, fascinating and well deserved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to hold up the Steampunk trilogy so that people could see that without
That's the newest edition from Open Road Press. Thanks, Gil.
And what can you tell us about the Steampunk trilogy itself, the book?
Well, I should back up a minute, maybe without boring the audience who might probably know all this. But Cyberpunk, we're talking about 1985, 1986, 87. Cyberpunk had just become a big thing. And in the pages of Locus magazine, which is kind of like a trade journal of the science fiction world, in the pages of Locus magazine, a very good writer named K.W. Jeter, still with us today, although I haven't seen a book from him in maybe 5 years or so. So I hope he's still feeling productive. But in the pages of Locus magazine, K.W. Jeter sent in a letter, and he said, what the heck is going on with Cyberpunk? It seems kind of a silly label. The work is okay. And in fact, Jeter was kind of retroactively shanghaied into the Cyberpunk movement. Some of his early work was deemed to be kind of a precursor of Cyberpunk. But in any case, Jeter's letter continued. He said, I can just picture a bunch of these silly names cropping up. He said, what about Steampunk? And that was the birth of the term. It's you now know the exact coiner of that term, K.W. Jeter. And as soon as he said it, it was ironic because he said it in kind of an ironic, sarcastic, joking way, but it was instantly adopted as a handy reference point for a certain kind of fiction. And it's funny how the power of words or labels, because as soon as that term appeared, everybody instantly knew what it was. They said, oh yeah, steampunk, I know what that is. That's like Michael Moorcock's quasi-Victorian novels that were written like 10 years ago, and we never knew what to call them, but now we know what to call them. They're steampunk, and so the power of a label is immense. Sometimes it can really define a whole school of creative activity. So I saw that letter in Locus, and I said, yeah, I know what steampunk is, and it's kind of attractive to me, and I think I could do some stories in that mode. And so that's kind of the birth of the steampunk trilogy. The stories began their life as magazine appearances, and then when I had done 3 of them, and I've subsequently done more in that mode that's not collected in that volume. After I had done 3 of them, I realized they made kind of a nice book, and they're pretty much standalone, except there's a few links between each story. Like you might get a mention of one character in the from the first story in the second one, so on. But once I realized I had a book's worth, I approached a small press, and I chose them out of an ancient reference guide, and this is all really pre-internet. I'm pretty sure commercial email was in existence. I'm trying to, the birth of the digital era is both relatively close, and it seems like prehistory now, because we're so immersed in the digital era. But I seem to remember.
I personally remember it well.
Yeah. I seem to recall that I had email at that time, but there was no such thing as the web to look things up with. Mm-hmm. So I turned to my handy-dandy thick paperback reference manual called The Writer's Market. And this was an annual publication that was put out by Writer's Digest magazine. And it was what it said. It was, you open it up, and it started with the letter A, and it said Abbeville Press. Currently, the editor there is Joe Schmo, and his address is 151 Broadway, New York. And so you dashed off a letter to Joe Schmo, and you said, and people were much more open to non-agented works in that era. And you dashed off a letter and said, my name's Paul Di Filippo. I've got this volume called the Steampunk Trilogy. Here's a couple of sentences of what it's like, and would you be interested in seeing the entire manuscript? And you either got a yes or a no, and after you got a no, you moved on to your next choice. So I was reading in Writer's Market, and I saw this description of a publisher with a very strange name. They were called 4 Walls, 8 Windows. And I said, well, that's a cool name. What about them? And I read their description, and it said, open to this, that, and the other. And, the usual blather. We want high quality work that's entertaining and so forth. And so I said, well, okay, let me give them a try. And I wrote to them, and they said, yeah, send the manuscript in. And it was accepted, and that was a huge step in my career. It felt like a certain kind of validation and moving up the professional ladder a little bit. And I was working at Brown University Bookstore at the time. Yes, okay, I'm looking at that question. The Will Smith's movie version of the Wild Wild West is indeed hailed as kind of a core steampunk item, but this is an example. The original TV show from the 60s was retroactively deemed steampunk. It was like nobody knew the word at the time, but looking backwards, after the word had been coined, people could say, oh yeah, that TV show in the 60s, that was kind of like proto-steampunk or seminal steampunk that we didn't even really know what what we were doing at the time, or we didn't know it had a name. So it's amazing what a label can do in terms of codifying a whole art form. So at the time the Steampunk trilogy came out, I was working as a clerk at Brown University Bookstore, and I tried not to. I certainly didn't want to boast, or I needed that job as to pay the rent, and I didn't get. I probably got like $2,000 for my advance on the Steampunk book. And I tried not to make a big deal of it. People at the store, my fellow employees, didn't even know I was interested in writing. But somehow it became public knowledge at the store. And it felt kind of cool, although also kind of humbling and not disappointing. But, it's like, geez, I've got a book on the shelf here in my own store, and I'm still running the cash register just to make ends meet, So that's the kind of reaction frequently that fills a writer's life, is a mix of triumph and disgust. Mm-hmm. So, but they were wonderful about it. I was regarded as kind of like the pet author in the store. Somebody who actually. Here we were selling books, and we had somebody in the store who was actually producing books. We did have that store. I loved working at Brown University Bookstore. At times, it was like every job. It was annoying, and you wished you were doing other things, but in retrospect, that was kind of a neat period, and I learned about bookselling from the not only from the author's end, but from the retail end of things too, which I think was actually kind of helpful.
I want to share my screen here and just give people an idea of exactly how much output you've had.
Well, over 40 years, it tends to add up. But I'm actually, compared to a lot of authors, I'm kind of in the mid-range, I guess. I'm not, like, you take somebody like Ted Chiang, who's a marvelous writer and really kind of a genius science fiction writer, and he's produced maybe 2 or 3 books over his career, and yet each one is so wonderful that how do you measure, quantity versus quality? Hopefully I've got a little of both in my ball court.
I would say you've got plenty of both. But the list goes on and on and on.
Well, you know what somebody told me recently. So I do a humor column for fantasy and science fiction, mm-hmm. and I've written. They're collected in 3 volumes, and the humor columns are short, so each volume has like 40 or 50 little columns in it. So that's like 150 humor columns. But somebody told me recently, I never really counted those as stories, but somebody said, each of those columns has like a cast of characters and a plot and dialogue and all the other good stuff. And so you should count them as stories. So I guess if you add in those 150 humor columns, the total of my output like almost doubles. But I never thought of them as stories. I just thought of them as silly kind of satires or other miscellaneous essay type things.
And I'm just doing this strictly to give the audience an idea of your output.
Oh, you're too kind to me, Gil.
This is really...
Well, see, now you're into the review work. Now, to supplement the fiction, not that it's a huge income, but also to kind of keep my professional curiosity alive about what constitutes the genre, I do a lot of review work. And in fact, I just finished one review today for Locus, that trade magazine that I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And to see what your peers are doing and to have to think analytically about it is a very useful procedure. I think it's a very handy means of staying abreast of what's happening, and especially like I know the classic field inside out, but the field's always evolving, and to stay aware of what new younger writers are doing is immensely important, I think.
I agree. I'm curious. Have you been approached, or has anyone optioned any of your work for film?
Well, very little, very little. I can tell you my one big film story, but there was a woman, a scriptwriter, who for several years had kept renewing the option for a single short story of mine, which she thought would make a great film, and she was going to do the script, and but she tried, using her contacts to get a deal, and it never happened. And over the past year or two, she's let the option lapse. So I suspect that might be the end of that particular path. But about 15 years ago, I was approached by this fellow who had impeccable Hollywood credentials. He had been the producer on several films, including The Last Samurai.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't that Tom Cruise, I think. It was a Tom Cruise film, The Last Samurai. And this fellow had read my collection Ribofunk, and he thought it would bits and pieces of that could be adapted for the screen. And he had a proposition. He paid, some option money, but then he said, let's write the script together, and it'll be purely on spec at this point. And then, if we have a script in hand, studios might look at us with more interest. So for about a year, he and I thrashed out this script based on the Ribofunk stories, and I learned quite a bit about script writing. The the arcs that Hollywood favors, and big reveals and all that other good stuff. And so we were calling our script by the title of one of the stories in Ribofunk. There's a story. Now, I should back up a minute and say Ribofunk is all about this future where genetic engineering and other good biological stuff is kind of superseded digital technology almost. So anyway, we were calling our script The Bad Splice. And that was Splice was kind of a nickname or a slang term for a hybrid biological creation, like half human, half cheater or whatever. So anyway, our movie was The Bad Splice, and we worked hard on it for a year, and finally we had a script that met with this guy's approval. And just at that moment, what do you know? A film debuted called The Splice, and it was in the theaters just as we were ready to market ours. And it was a similar premise. It was about creating these hybrid chimerical creatures. And I never watched the film because, of course, I was so disgusted. I don't think it was necessarily identical with what we were doing, because I think our script was set 50 years in the future, where this kind of technology had been dominant and omnipresent. And I think from what I recall of the movie, it was like a day after tomorrow type scenario where scientists were working on these these new kind of creatures. So in any case, my professional buddy there said, this pretty much kills us. Nobody's going to even want to look at this script. And that's where it ended. I still have the script sitting on my hard drive. And I often thought, we were talking a little while ago about self-publishing. I thought it might be fun to actually create a little chapbook of that script and get it out there to the world just as kind of a little oddity. Harlan Ellison, one of my friends and role models and people I grew up on reading, he did that quite often. His most famous instance probably was he had done a script for Asimov's I, Robot. Mm-hmm. And it's not the Will Smith I, Robot that came along afterwards, but Ellison had done this script and it went nowhere. It eventually died, and he said, well, you know what, I'm going to publish the plain old script as a book, just so people...
As Harlan Ellison was wont to do.
Yes, exactly. He said, I'm going to get this out there just because, I invested a lot of work and energy into it, and people can see the movie that never was. They can kind of do a mental run through based on the script of what would have been up on the screen. So I often thought it might be kind of fun for me to do that. But actually, I have to. The only reason I've hesitated is we created that script under a program called Final Draft, which is...
I have a copy.
Right. Final Draft is kind of like the industry standard for script writing, formatting. And my version of Final Draft expired, and I can't actually even open the files now. I'm going to have to invest...
Me too.
Yeah, I'm going to have to invest in a new version of Final Draft if I ever want to recover those files, I think, unless I get some expert to... port them over to a different platform.
I was interested to know about your near misses with Hollywood, because it seems to me like so many of your stories are very fertile ground for...
Well, thank you, Gil. I think
that kind of thing.
Not only that, but I did a trilogy of crime novels a couple of years ago, and to me, those are eminently filmable. I mean, obviously, they're all contemporary settings. There's no CGI involved, and I think those three crime novels could be brought to the screen kind of in the manner of, the way that some of the work of Don Westlake or Elmore Leonard has been filmed. To me, those three crime novels are eminently filmable, but no biting on those yet. So we'll have to see. If you consider, I think the oh God. I think the latest statistic is something like 1,500 books published every year in the science fiction field. Maybe it's even
90% of them are crap.
Well, you've got that too. Sturgeon's law. We mentioned Theodore Sturgeon. He was famous for coining the maxim: 90% of everything is crap. But out of the dozen or 100 or 50 good books that appear every year, how many are even considered for an option? It's just the ratio is just so discouraging that you can't let it discourage you. I mean, if it happens, that's great, but you can't base your whole career on expecting it to happen.
This is kind of maybe a more personal question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
How do you feel about having been nominated for all the great awards and not taking home any?
Yeah, well, it's a little discouraging. I did win one British Science Fiction Award. And the little trophy came in the mail, and my name was misspelled on the base of it. So, so that I see a question up here that we can address later. So that was typical. You win an award, and then it's botched up a little. And I did win a French prize. They have the French have annual. An annual prize, rather, like the Hugos or the Nebulas, and I did win one of those. So I've taken home a couple, but the usual, like at the Emmys and Oscars and stuff, people say, "Oh, it's a privilege just to be nominated," and it is a cliche, but I think it's a valid. Like all cliches, it has a seed of truth in it, or it wouldn't have originated in the first place. So, like just a couple of days ago, that same British Science Fiction Association, they put one of my works up on their long list of recommended titles. So for folks who don't know the nomination process, most awards, they start out with what they call the long list. Mm-hmm. And that's like, here are like the top 50 works of the year. And then the judges or the voting membership narrow down the long list, and then all of a sudden one day there's a press release that says, here's the short list for the award. And so the 50 books have been winnowed down to the 5 best or whatever, and then finally, of course, is the actual voting on the award, and then the 5 contenders, one emerges victorious. So one of my recent stories just got put on the BSFA long list, and that felt good. A little hint of acknowledgement or recognition. So it you can't. And then the award process is like all human endeavors. It's totally flawed, and you can pick it apart endlessly. So you have to keep that in mind. And I certainly wouldn't refuse an award, but not to have one is not the biggest disappointment in my career.
And while we're on the subject, could you give us a brief comment or maybe how you feel about what's been going on with the Sadrabid Puppies thing?
Well, that they seem to be in quiescence now. They're not. Everything fell apart on their end of things, and they made whatever point. I think they registered whatever point they had to register, but then it just wasn't being bought by the field at large, and so they kind of disappeared or quit playing that particular game. But in terms of I prefer to look at it as the eternal problem of human cliquishness. There's always been cliques and log rolling and back scratching. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And there comes a time when there are certain eras where cliquishness seems to have been transcended in favor of pure quality, and then there are other eras where this kind of incestuous self-approval seems predominant. So I think right now, I hate to say it, but I think it's all part and parcel of the factionalism and partisanship of the society at large. We all know that, the U.S., the world, Europe, the U.S. is not alone in this. The European countries are experiencing it. We're breaking down into tribes, which is a prehistoric state of affairs.
We're moving backwards rather than forward.
We're regressing to very tribal behaviors, and we thought for a while that we had surmounted that, and done better than that. But apparently, it's just such a facet, an inbuilt, hardwired facet of the human nature that it's becoming very hard to avoid. So, the sad puppies. I'm not going to pick apart their arguments and contrast them with their
Mm-hmm.
rivals and who's got the better argument, and maybe this one is 50% right and or 49% right and the other guy is 51% right. So you could do that all day, but I think that only contributes to the increasing tribalism. I maybe it's because I'm like an old hippie who like to imagine a world where everyone got along and applauded each other for their particular individuality. But I don't think that's. I think awards are being determined based on which tribe you belong to, rather than the sheer quality of each individual work. So that's a sad state of affairs, I think.
Yeah, indeed. When I attended the WorldCon in 2016, the Mid Americon 2,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I chose not to have a voting membership
Uh-huh.
because I felt like it was, you know, a throw up your hands kind of
Yeah.
moment. That, what can one person do? And then since then, I've looked back at it and thought, well, if everybody felt that way, it's just going to continue.
Mm.
And you should have really, gone in and
Mm-hmm.
rubbed elbows with all those people and voted. And
Mm-hmm.
I
See
guess
now.
that will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Well, there's always future occasions where you can make your principles and your voice heard. See, now I was a judge for 6 years for one of the somewhat prestigious awards. It's the John Campbell Best Novel Award. Now, there's two there's two John Campbell Awards, or there were. The There was the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, but because his name has fallen into disgrace, that award now has a new name, which I'm not even sure of. It's only the past 2 or 3 years that they've changed the name. But parallel to that, there was another award named for John Campbell, seminal SF editor of Astounding and Analog, and that was the best novel of the year. And so that award was not decided by mass public voting. There was 6 or 7 judges, and I was one of them. And I like to think that that our tenure, at least as I experienced it for those 6 years, our fulfillment of our duty was almost the ideal. Because you had, among those 6 or 7 people, you had a huge range of, well, most of them were working writers. I think like 4 out of the 7 were working writers, fiction writers. So you had people with their own axes to grind, except they refused to grind them. Like, for instance, I don't think this is spilling any beans, because the names of the judges were all public knowledge. One of the judges was Greg Benford, who's known, for his kind of hardcore, real physics-oriented science fiction. Mm-hmm. And yet, when he was discussing some nominees, he would be just as open to, some work that was totally out of his ballpark, and was approaching science fiction from a whole different vector. And he really put down his personal prejudices, like we all did. And we took each novel and we tried to, it's that old critical standard. You don't you don't look at a book and say, well, I wish this is what he had done. You say, what was the author's intentions, and did he accomplish it in a aesthetic, graceful, competent manner? And so that was the only standard that we really applied to all these different myriad different books that came under our purview. And you only wish that somehow and nobody, we had all the discussions occurred online because we were all the judges were scattered all around the globe. And so there was never any flame wars or bickering or name calling or intemperate language. People just really rose to the demands of this somewhat prestigious award and really did a good job in the judging. And I try to, uphold my personal end of it too. And in fact, the reason I quit as a Campbell Award judge was simply because it was during the era, like you say, the Sad Puppies, where things just out, not among us judges, but out in the greater world of science fiction, things started to get too tribal and too partisan. And I could just envision a day further down the line where like a novel would come to us and it would have so much baggage associated with it that I could not get past any publicity that might have attached to it and look at the book with objective eyes. And so I said to myself, I don't want to be put in that position where I'm battling my own prejudices because this book has like pushed so many buttons already among the mass public. So that's kind of why I stepped down from the award. And it was a sad thing too, because I had enjoyed, the camaraderie of my fellow judges, and I felt we really, if you can look at the Wikipedia page for the John Campbell Award, and you can make your own estimates. You can see the slate of novels that we picked and who were the ultimate winners. So folks can kind of try to verify my praise of this award by looking at the items themselves.
Of course, living here in Lawrence, Kansas.
Right, you're there at the James Gunn Center.
Exactly. James Gunn was a hero of mine, and I'm happy to say that he was my mentor.
That's so great.
I graduated from the Center for the Study of Science Fiction at the University of Kansas.
That's wonderful, Gil.
And that's where they give away the Theodore Sturgeon Award.
Yep.
And they have the Campbell Conference.
Yep.
And, what a heady experience that was. Going through the writer's workshop, the year that I attended, there were 18 of us, and we had 3 stories each. So we had 50-some stories to go through. Mm-hmm. And that was a really interesting experience. But the thing that really struck me was when the celebrity editors came in. I believe it was... I always get Frederick Pohl and Pohl Anderson mixed up. I think it was Frederick Pohl and his wife, Elizabeth Ann Hall.
Yeah, she was one of the Campbell judges.
Yeah. And, boy, they made great use of red marker. Professor Gunn, wrote on the back of one of my stories or essays, I guess, actually, for class, as many pages as I had actually written.
Wow.
He had written, on the back. It was called Cyberpunk, the Genre That Wasn't. Mm-hmm. And the thesis was that cyberpunk was really science fiction, and science fiction was really cyberpunk, because we start out with The Terminal Man by Michael Crichton, and then we move on to Mind Killer by Spider Robinson, and then we have, of course, Neuromancer by William Gibson, and the conceit was that in the science fiction versions, the two previous books that I mentioned, that this was tracing the history of cyberpunk through the Wirehead, and the thesis was, the conceit was that in science fiction, the Wirehead was strictly into it for pleasure, and then in cyberpunk, the Wirehead was in it to get business done, and
I like that. That's
Professor. I thought it was a great idea, but Professor Gunn said no. Cyberpunk is supposed to be this. He was very, very by the book, and he, after all, was the bearer of the science fiction torch for many years. And at this Worldcon in Kansas City, he was made a grand master of science fiction, and I was the first person up there to get my copy of Campus signed.
Nice.
And unfortunately, we lost Professor Gunn a few years ago.
Yeah.
But
last year I just enjoyed his biography, a little autobiography he did. I picked it up after his death and was very touched and moved by his personal life story.
Yeah, it was just a wonderful experience, and something that I would encourage anyone to do, any kind of writer's workshop, wherever they are. Paul, why do you think it is that so many science fiction writers are interested in writing crime novels?
Well, it's always intrigued me, and as I mentioned earlier, I've put my own 2 cents worth in with this trilogy of crime books recently, a year or 2 ago. I think a lot of science fiction, at least in the old days, revolved around that term that's you don't hear too much these days, ratiocination. Logic, deduction, intellectual hypotheses, and problem solving. And so I think that you take a story like there's a famous Hal Clement story where, not Mission of Gravity, his most famous novel, but there's one where the first moon landing happens, and the guy steps out of the moon probe, and he finds out instantly that the moon dust is electrostatic and it coats his visor of his helmet. And the rest of the story is how do I, and he can't even see his way back to the ship, and there's a feasible explanation why he's all alone, kind of like in the Martian movie. And he has to figure out, how can I possibly clean my visor so I can get back to the ship? And it's such and Clement, being the good writer and logician that he was, wrings a ton of suspense and human interest out of this what could be a minor physical quirk of the universe. So that kind of impulse to write that kind of science fiction story, there's the Martian. That impulse to write that kind of science fiction story, I think, brought a lot of science fiction writers to the classic mystery, where there's a problem to be solved and clues, and you're dealing not only with physical evidence and physical actions, but also the human dynamic too. which was actually probably something that was more slighted in the science fiction tales, which traditionally downplayed the human element. So, but if you look at the field, it's amazing. You have Frederick Brown, obviously a master in both science fiction and the mystery field. And you could just name people. Jack Vance did a ton of mysteries. Avram Davidson, Theodore Sturgeon even wrote an Ellery Queen novel, and it just goes on. And I think there's some kind of overlap between the problem-solving ethos of science fiction and the problem-solving capabilities of the traditional, private eye, or whether
I think you just nailed it.
Yeah, whether he's a professional private eye or an amateur, somebody who's just kind of like thrust into the middle of a dire situation and has to figure it out. So that, I think, appealed to people. Of course, a lot of it was professionalism. If you wanted to make a living as a professional writer, you had to train yourself to be good at a variety of things. So, the science fiction market is slumping this year. I'll turn my hand to writing a mystery novel.
Do you feel that science fiction has finally broken through into the mainstream?
Well, I really think it has, because we are seeing so many novels that are coming from big name authors, big name publishers, and they're not even labeled science fiction. I think because our mode of writing has become like one of the default tools of storytelling. Obviously, the media, the cinematic media has done a huge amount to make science fiction palatable to a mass audience. But I think writers, too, you look at something like that Station 11, which was a miniseries recently and was a fairly good selling novel by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, that book, she has no roots in the genre as we know it, but yet she felt so comfortable working in what is pure science fiction. Her story, if she had been writing 50 years ago, she would have had to go to Ace Books or Del Rey or Ballantine or something. She wouldn't have been published by Knopf or Farrar Straus, whoever her publisher was. So I think when you see examples like that, and obviously something like The Handmaid's Tale, which is pure literature. Nobody in the New Yorker will refer to Handmaid's Tale without ever using the word science fiction. So I think there's so much evidence around us that our very niche, peculiar way of telling stories and looking at the world has kind of conquered to some degree the former mainstream naturalism that was dominant.
I think it's really interesting how science fiction has permeated pop culture, especially with streaming, like with shows like Altered Carbon and The Expanse. I was really interested after the whole Game of Thrones debacle. I was really interested to see that the guys that were writing the TV show were using a pseudonym, just as they had with James Corey, and that they were the same guys that wrote the books. And it didn't really come out until almost after The Expanse was done. What are your feelings about shows like Altered Carbon and The Expanse and the books from which they're derived?
Well, I've loved the Expanse books. I loved Altered Carbon. I haven't really followed the cinematic adaptations of them. But from what I've seen, they seem to be very authentic translations. I'm sure there have been adaptations that had to be made to get more visuality or more dialogue in certain spots, but it seems as if they are the original sources are respected. They're not treated lightly. The people who are adapting them want to do some justice to these original works. So it's very heartening to imagine that because when you look at you go back to Star Trek, the original Star Trek, and it was deemed, it had a lot of leftover elements from 1950s type science fiction. But the newer elements that it did introduce to the screen were deemed to be revolutionary at the time, and yet now they look like just the very minimum prerequisites for doing good science fiction. So when you look at how far we've come since in the 50 years, there's Forbidden Planet, and
that's I think largely considered the template for Star Trek, the original series.
And it was kind of the apex of 50s science fiction. They were doing things as courageously and authentically as they knew how. So you've got Forbidden Planet representing one milestone, and then Star Trek representing a further advancement. But when you look at, and then if you go from like Star Trek to The Expanse, wow, it's just, we really have come a long way, even though it might not be, we don't even realize it just because we take for granted this high level of production.
I really have to recommend, Paul, if you have Amazon Prime, and even if you don't,
which I do,
that please treat yourself to at least one episode of The Expanse.
I love the books. I'm behind. I haven't read the final book yet, but
just drop in on one episode of the fourth season and just watch one episode, and then if you want, you can start over and go from the beginning. But it's really, really good. They have physics consultants, and so while they are moving people around on wires, so that it looks like they're in either microgravity or no gravity, the physicists that they have as consultants are telling them which direction they should be going.
Wow.
And all this kind of thing. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah. Well, the old saying about genius being 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration, you can't fudge the details there if you want the results to show up on the screen.
It's really heartening to me that hard science fiction is breaking through, like with The Martian, as you mentioned, and The Expanse certainly spares, no, the word's eluding.
They're very rigorous.
Yeah, very, very much so, and it's beautiful to watch.
Mm-hmm.
The special effects are really good and very realistic. When a ship is burning toward the rim or what have you, it looks like a documentary. And then when you get into the human stories and the characters and everything, it's just as in the books, delightful, wonderful.
Now,
so I would recommend that.
Dare we mention Foundation, which I've enjoyed. I've seen the first
I haven't seen it.
episodes.
Please do tell us.
Well, I've seen the first 5 episodes, and it's beautiful. It's visually beautiful. There are some ideas being treated with respect, some philosophies and so on, but it diverges so much from Asimov's original. You do kind of have to. This is an instance where I think uh, they unlike The Expanse, they have not. They've just used the original books as kind of a kicking off place, and then uh, altered them so much that you really, to enjoy Foundation, you really have to consider it as a work of uniquely new science fiction, and not having much to do with Asimov's original at all. But if you can take it on that basis, in fact, I don't know, maybe I should watch another episode tonight to firm up my opinion of it. But the first episode was remarkably authentic, but then it started to diverge from the source material.
Yeah.
Right after that.
I would like to, at this point, hold up some novels and short story collections and ask you to give us a brief summary of each.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
Sounds like fun. Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
So tell us about WikiWorld.
Well, now that is a short story collection, and I'm very happy because it went out of print, and I just got it back into print. So if you go to Amazon, you'll see a new cover for WikiWorld because it's the new edition. And basically, what I do with so I started having. When I first started writing or assembling my stories, they were all thematic collections. So Steampunk Trilogy contained steampunk stories. Ribofunk had all the genetic engineering stories. Fractal Paisleys is my kind of humorous SF collection. Kind of, you mentioned Robert Sheckley. You can kind of think of it as my Sheckley type stories. And Strange Trades had a rather curious premise. It was all stories that kind of featured working stiff characters, like they were all revolved around vocations or jobs of the future or economic angles to science fiction. So, but by the time, and then Lost Pages is stories about writers. But more than stories about writers, they're counterfactual stories about writers. They're Gil, you're a miracle man here. Yep, there's Lost Pages, the original edition, and so those are stories about writers that I admired, but they're all counterfactual. I tried, and hence that's the Lost Pages aspect of things. I tried to imagine alternate lifetimes for writers that I admired. But once I had assembled like 5 or 6 of these thematic collections, I started realizing that I had run out of themes, or rather, perhaps my fiction had become less thematic in a way. I wasn't writing these suites of stories. I was writing, every story was kind of its own thing, and there were no linkages or thematic or otherwise among them. So my collections started to be, 2 years has passed since my last book, and I've got 20 stories, and these stories all appeared, since the last time, and I'll just grab them all and stuff them into a single volume. So which is what most people do. You don't see really so many thematic collections anymore. It used to be more of a thing, but basically all my collections from a certain point on, it's like, okay, these are the stories I wrote over the last 18 months. Here they are now in book form. So Wiki World is one of those latter era collections, and the title story I'm still kind of proud of. It imagines kind of an anarchist, well, it's not an anarchist future because there is government and organization, but it's based on the kind of collaborative distributed democracy that makes Wikipedia function. So if you can imagine like taking the tenets of like, anybody can write a Wikipedia article, but then it's vetted by your fellow Wikipedians. If you take those that kind of precepts and try to apply them to how government might work, that's what WikiWorld is all about. And there's a huge assortment of stories in there. I think there's one story titled simply Providence, which is about the future of my native city, in a time when humans have been rendered extinct by the robot rebellion and there's nothing but robots populating Providence. So there's a huge variety of stories in that, and I think if you look at my subsequent collections, you'll see the same thing. You might find a volume that has a couple of steampunk items in it, and a couple of I've written some ribofunk stories that are outside the initial volume, and so they've been collected. So I think readers might actually like that better in a way. I'm hoping they like it because each volume has a wide variety of stuff within it.
And since this is the book that we should be plugging, what can you tell us about
this? Yeah, Summer Thieves. This is my most recent novel. It came out in August of 2021, and it's a space opera, but I like to think of it as kind of a, well, it's a bit old-fashioned and it's a bit postmodern all at once. I think I said earlier that it's kind of my homage to Jack Vance. So the language in Summer Thieves is a little bit Rococo because Jack Vance was a famous believer in kind of a not an obscure or elaborate prose style, but rather a kind of polished and maybe a little begemmed kind of prose style. And I tried to emulate that without going overboard in the Summer Thieves. But, it's funny, way back in the Cyberpunk era, that we're talking like 30 years ago, I wrote a little essay for a fanzine about how space opera was a kind of fudging it because there were only two kinds of political setups in space operas. Either you had the Star Wars system where there was an emperor and
the hero's journey,
and right, but I'm talking about the political systems. Either the whole galaxy, there was an emperor and maybe some nobility. Yeah, and so Dune does this too. Dune has the dukes and lords and so forth. And it was an interesting setup for a while, imagining kind of space nobility and courts, interstellar courts and stuff. So that was one method of that space operas employed. And then the other method was the Star Trek method, where everything was technocratic and logical. You had the Federation, and there were rival political entities, the Klingons or whoever. But basically, humans had decided, it was kind of very much an H.G. Wells vision of the future. Wells was famous. He said, we need a world government, and it should be run by scientists and technicians and smart people, and maybe we don't even need elections if we get those people running things correctly.
It reminds me of the old saying, those that are the most fit to lead are the least willing.
Yeah, exactly. So you had on the one hand you had the uh, Roman Empire in space. That was one method of organizing the galaxy, and on the other hand, you had the Star Trek method, which was a very sane and logical federation type government of laws and legislation and so on. So those two modes, I think every space opera you read pretty much features those two modes, one of those two modes of being, except when you get a few people like Chip Delaney with Nova, his famous space opera. Things are a little different there. And he also did a subsequent space opera, Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, where the political economic setup was very different. And then Ian Banks was famous for having kind of a weird libertarian autonomous setup. And M. John Harrison another British writer, did a couple of great space operas. So when I wanted to write the Summer Thieves, I said, I'm certainly not going to go the Empire route, especially, Star Wars has just made that a cliche. And I didn't want to quite go the Federation route either. So I said, well, how do we organize ourselves here currently? And I had just read an article about how there were basically 5 corporations that dominated our current existence and were almost or equally powerful as governments in terms of what they could achieve and what got done. And those 5 corporations were, now I'm probably going to forget one, it was Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and maybe Microsoft, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Those were but you can see what kind of players we're talking about here. So this essay, just a contemporary op-ed essay said, these 5 corporations really determine the shape of our current existence, almost more so than governments do. And I said, well, why couldn't I come up with 5 analogous interstellar firms that kind of worked as a government? And that's the underpinning. Obviously that's not what the book is about. That's just the background of the Summer Thieves. There's a highly personal adventure within the book that is the nucleus of the book. But the background of the book is, I said, how could you organize the galaxy differently than it's been organized in the past? And that's why the book is called The Quinary, because there are these 5 interstellar corporations that more or less function as a government without actually labeling themselves to be a government.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to ask you to go into rapid fire mode here.
Yes, of course. I see we're nearing the end of our time.
Yeah,
it's been so wonderful, Gil. I wish we were side by side hoisting a beer together, but this is the next best thing.
Oh, we will. What can you tell us about The Big Get Even?
That's one of my crime novels. That's the first one. It's a caper novel with a little twist. It's the 2 protagonists are the narrator is a disbarred lawyer. He's just gotten out of prison for some illegal shenanigans, and he happens to hook up with this kind of street smart tough guy, Hood, and together they set about pulling off a crime. And those 2 characters continue in the next 2 books. Yeah, this is The Deadly Kiss Off. That's the return of the same 2 guys, Glenn and Stan. A lawyer, a kind of fussy, overeducated lawyer, and a guy who his primary means of earning an income was being an arsonist. So it's I thought it was an unlikely mating of characters that would work well, complementing each other. And the third book is called The Mezcal Crackup. I think you've got a copy right there. Yep. So, it's funny. Now, people might be interested in the quirks of a writing career. So for decades, I had said to myself, I'm going to write a novel about the tequila industry. And so I said, I don't know what put it in my head, but I just read an article about the tequila industry, and it seemed fascinating. I said, I bet I could eke out a novel from that. So literally decades went by, and then I read about mezcal, which is like tequila's sexier cousin. And I said, okay, tequila's out the window now. That's old hat. I'll write a book about the mezcal industry. But I never could find a hook. And then into the actual narrative, and then these two guys came along.
Oh, let me guess. And then the worm turned.
Yeah, that's
sorry, I had to.
Well, actually, I make a big point of that. The real high-end mezcal disdains the worm. The mezcal you buy with the worm in it is like the low-end stuff that the real purists disdain. So anyway, I said I said, I've got these two characters. What kind of third caper can they go on? And somehow that fused with my fascination with the mezcal industry. And so I finally got to do that book, which 30 years ago, the nature of it was unseen by me, and I could never have predicted that this is how it would emerge. And, so you should be open. You should be open to serendipity. That's for sure.
Again, in the rapid fire mode, what can you tell us about World Shifter?
That's the recent volume that just got nominated on the long list for an award. Keep your fingers
congratulations, Mazel Tov.
Well, it's got a long path to go before it makes the final ballot, and then of course it'll be up against some superb contenders, I'm sure, but it's made the first baby step towards getting an award. And so that's another space opera, and it involves kind of a the famous Salinger, oh God, why am I blanking on? Lenny, the kind of dumb guy.
Yes.
I'm totally blanking on the name of that tale.
I am too.
But in any case, I thought, what if I had this fairly simple, call him kind of a simpleton. He has a big heart, and he's just doesn't have a huge intellect.
Of Mice and Men.
Of Mice and Men. How could we forget that? So I said, what if you took Lenny from Of Mice and Men and kind of set him in this interstellar galactic civilization? How would he fare? And so he's the protagonist of World Shifter, and I thought I did a pretty good job with that.
And Tiger Stripe says World Shifter is a great title. And
thanks so much.
Speaking of great titles, again in rapid fire mode, what can you tell us about Roadside Bodhisattva?
That is a purely mainstream naturalistic novel. I always tell people I had fun writing it, but it felt like I had one hand tied behind my back because you're writing about these characters who the primary drama is their emotional interactions, and there's an act of friendship and betrayal and stuff, and all that stuff is very primal and interesting. But on the other hand, because I'm a natural born science fiction fantastical guy, you keep wanting to interject like a ghost or a dragon or something, and you can't do that because you're writing this very naturalistic mainstream novel. It's about a runaway boy who falls into this particular setting and kind of the maturation experiences he undergoes. So, I believe in trying everything once. That was my kind of... I do too. That was kind of my, not Catcher in the Rye book. I don't know what you'd compare it to, but it was kind of my, teenager goes on an odyssey of a painful odyssey of learning how to be an adult kind of book.
The Vision Quest walkabout.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Except he wasn't really even trying to get better. He was just living his life, and things happened that made him, mature.
And
anyhow, that's
let's see what YouTube will let me get away with if I ask you quickly about ciphers.
A little nakedness. So Ciphers is my Thomas Pynchon novel. If anybody liked Gravity's Rainbow, you should pick up Ciphers. It's yes. Now look at that ridiculous picture of me on the back. And why did I pose like that? Because the photographer who was there to take my picture said, "Take off your shirt." And I did it because he was a professional photographer. It's like, why do we do these things just because an expert asks us to? But in any case, Ciphers is a vast conspiracy novel, which starts out in about the year 5000 BC and comes up. Well, the main action takes place in the present day, which back then was like 1990 or whatever. But it's full of allusions to pop culture and pop music and strange Illuminati type doings. Like I had to laugh when I saw Robert Anton Wilson on the lead in here because his books were a big influence on Ciphers. And so that, once again, I've never written anything really like that afterwards. So it was my attempt to stake out a certain claim within a certain genre.
Okay, so we're kind of getting down to the wire. I have two more that I want to ask you about.
Sure.
The first one being A Mouthful of Tongues.
Now, this is, once again, I try not to repeat myself. This is, there's become another fashionable term lately called body horror.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, body horror, once that term was invented, you could kind of cast your gaze back retrospectively and say, oh, yeah, this story by Poe was body horror, even though the term didn't exist when Poe was alive. So Mouthful of Tongues is, it's not only body horror, though, it's also my kind of foray into magical realism. It takes place in this imaginary South American, Central American country. And so I try to utilize a lot of the Garcia Marquez style and mode of storytelling. So once again, another foray into a strange little niche of our field.
And then we'll end with what I think is probably an important book, The Plumage.
Oh yeah, that's that. I can't see if that's the first volume of humor columns. It might be the second. I'm not sure. I forget. I think that's the first one. So these humor columns.
It says it's the all-new 25th anniversary collection.
Oh, no. There you go. That's the third volume that you've got there. I had forgotten what the cover looked like. No, that's the third volume. And so these little squibs, these little humorous things. Well, it's funny. Back in high school, I wrote for the high school paper. And I did these little humor columns, age 17, 18, whatever. And here I am writing these little humorous essays. And now, 50 years later, I'm still doing these little humorous essays. So to some extent, they feel like my default native mode of existence. If some little headline provokes an absurdist idea, my first instinct is to turn it into one of these little humor columns. And most of them center around science fiction or the writing life or science fiction in various media. So I get a kick out of writing them. Hopefully, I've gotten some feedback that people enjoy reading them, and they're kind of fun to do. They're only like 1,000 words, 1,200 words a piece, and so you can knock one out in a day, 2 days, 3 days, or whatever. And they're like popcorn, I guess, or candy in that they're addictive and easy enough to scarf down.
Very good. Very good. At this point, I would like to announce my good friend and my main mod, Antiderivative Jill, who I refer to as Antiderivative Jill. Hello, Jill.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm delighted to see Masters of the Genre back, and I just love literature, so I enjoyed talking. I enjoyed listening to you talk about.
Oh, thanks so much. A pleasure. It's just, even after doing this for so many years, the fact that anybody reads anything I've written still feels like an honor and a privilege. So I'm just very grateful.
Yeah, and I have to say, have you been writing for 5 decades now or 4?
Well, I sold the first story in 1977, so what is that? 80s, 90s, aughts, 10s, and 20s. I guess you can say 5 decades now.
And Tiger Stripes in the chat asks, is there an online site where we can read Mr. Di Filippo's reviews or essays?
Well, if you go to locusmag.com, you'll find a whole slew of my stuff there. And there was also Barnes & Noble for about 5 or 7 years sponsored a site called the Barnes & Noble Review, and I did tons of work for them, and it's fingers crossed it's still currently extant on their platform. They don't publish new work anymore, but all my old essays are still up there. And so if you just go to Barnes & Noble Review and type my name into the search box, you should see literally like about 100 essays pop up.
Cool. And yeah, that was a great question.
Thanks.
So Jill, do we have our wheel ready and populated?
Yes, indeed, we do have our wheel populated with 6. 1, 2, 3.
Got a few entries.
7, 8, 9. 9 entries today.
Cool.
And you included yourself and Canadian Spider-Man and Darius, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and bring that wheel on. And this will be...
Oh, look at that. Very cool.
For the autographed copy of the Summer Thieves.
Yeah, and maybe a little something extra thrown in.
And again, thanks very much, Paul. That's very generous
pleasure.
of you. And Jill, whenever you feel like it, go ahead and give that wheel a spin.
This is high tech.
Yeah. Yay! Congratulations, nice. Crimson Mist.
Congratulations.
That's great.
Nice.
So, all Crimson Mist needs to do is get in touch with me on the About page of my channel. My email address is there. Send me your information, which I will forward to Paul.
Lovely.
And then we will get that out to you.
Now, also, I should say that one of my hobbies is mail art, which is decorated envelopes. So your postman will probably freak out a little when the envelope comes.
And if you don't mind, Paul, once the show is over, if you would hang out with me for just a little bit,
sure.
I would like to do a little behind-the-scenes a conversation with you, but it will be
Sure.
brief. It will be brief.
Yep. Yep.
So congratulations again to Crimson Mist. Jill, thank you so much for coming in and helping us with the high-tech spinner wheel.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jill.
I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
All right.
Be well.
Bye-bye. So we have just a little bit of time left. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask you to tell us about Infinite Fantastica.
Once again, a relatively recent story collection, 12 stories you can see, and it's a little bit of everything. I can't, without my copy to hand, I can't necessarily say what the range of stuff is, but it's heterogeneous. It's there could be a steampunk story on one page and a cyberpunk story on another, and just something very different on every page.
So something for everybody.
Yes, exactly.
And I did want to ask you actually earlier, but I forgot. What led to your interest in writing horror, and how do you think writers should approach writing horror?
Well, it's funny. I don't actually like all that much horror. It's not my favorite mode of entertainment among Fantastica. I should say that phrase Fantastica was coined by John Clute to include any kind of non-realistic writing. Fantastika, Fantastica. I find it a very useful umbrella term because it subsumes everything, science fiction, fantasy, horror,
genre fiction.
Surrealism, yeah. So among the major branches of Fantastica, horror is my least favorite. I mean, I love Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and a few other writers, Thomas Ligotti. But a lot of horror I find antithetical to my own personal worldview or desires to write something unreal. So I dabble in it very infrequently, and Mouthful of Tongues was kind of an experiment, and I think I carried it off fairly well, but I leave that to the readers to decide. And I don't know. I don't get inspired with horrific ideas that often. Like, you really have to have a genesis, a seed of, I don't know, you have to have a certain worldview to write horror successfully, I think. I once did a little essay where I tried to categorize science fiction, fantasy, and horror by their worldviews. And so I said science fiction, well, the essay, is kind of complex, but if I could break it down, I said science fiction believes in a rational universe, an atheistic universe where physics rules and rationality rules. And fantasy, on the other hand, believes in a world, populated with supernatural beings, a level of creature that's, not human, greater than man or lesser than man. But fantasy, aside from postulating that, also believes that the universe is basically benign and on our side. There might be evil in the universe, but it's not slanted. The universe is not slanted against humanity. And horror obviously believes in the supernatural and non-rational things, but it believes in kind of a malign universe. The universe is geared against humanity. And so I don't favor that particular interpretation of existence. And so I think that kind of makes it hard for me to write horror convincingly. But I think
one of the ways of characterizing that is a fairly common phrase these days. The universe does not care about you.
Right. But see, that's almost a science fictional statement because, if you step out into a vacuum without your spacesuit, you'll die because the universe doesn't care about you. So that's just sheer physics. But horror, I think, takes it one step further in that the universe actually hates you and
Right.
is out to do you evil, So I don't particularly subscribe to that, which makes it a little harder to write horror.
I've recently, by the way, been collecting a lot of Chaosium role-playing materials, the Call of Cthulhu and all their supplements and all that kind of thing. And as we talked about before the show, I became a lifetime member of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, which is fantastic. And I think the cosmic horror has a little bit better.
That borders on science fiction. That's why Lovecraft was so interested in astronomy and all the cutting edge revelations of his period.
Yeah, and the fact that it's had so much staying power with all the mythos and the mythos writers, Del Rey, and you name it.
Yeah, sure, sure.
It's a wonderful genre.
Yeah.
So,
well, on that note,
Jill has put in, the universe is not required to be in perfect harmony with human ambition.
Nice.
Carl Sagan. That's a good way to end the
Very
show.
apropos. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Gil, thanks so much.
And thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.
It's always a wonderful experience to have you on.
Thank you. And you've got the standing invitation to visit Providence.
I will take you up on that, sir.
Okay, good.
And
thanks to the audience and to anybody who might pick up one of my stories or books. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can be found where all good books are being sold.
Yes.
And that'll do it for this broadcast. Again, Paul, hang out for me just a minute. And until next time, it's Cardinal Sin, out.